let's look at the problems. This extraordinary malfunctioning of defence procurement. Again, there's another word, the woman word. The entire business of women in the armed forces and the other W word, the woke word. There seems to be an acute malfunctioning of the military brought about by this. I mean, the number of cases of sexual harassment and whatever. But Chris, what do you expect if you put young men and young women at the height of physical fitness in close proximity to each other? What does anybody expect will happen?
Well, I commanded mixed units, and it was quite clear. I mean, I used to say to my ship's company, look, I'm not going to say you can't do this because I'm not going to be able to stop you, I don't think. But if you can't get your trousers up by the time I get 8 clips off an armored door, I really don't want to go to war with you, so you won't be working with me in future. And you're right, David. You know, natural instincts of 18 to 24-year-olds are very much at the fore. The issue is that the political pressure is that the armed forces should represent the profile of society, not represent the society. Now, I'm of the view that you don't say the England football team has got to comprise so many quotas of various people. It's got to be the best you've got to
The best, and we've abandoned that view. I mean,
defeat the Germans.
it's most conspicuously abandoned, wasn't it, in the case of recruitment for RAF fighter pilot training? There was the famous business where a woman called time on saying we are turning away good male recruits, and for that worse female was. A woman did it. In other words, the very core. I mean, it is simply staggering, isn't it?
It's disgraceful. I mean, I have always said, and I still believe this, is that the way you structure your armed forces, whether it's in terms of your culture, your fighting doctrine, or whatever, is determined by the people you have to fight, not by your own society. And there is an element that says, I mean, there's been a strong view in the armed forces that unless you appeal to various elements in our society, you won't be able to recruit enough people. That's not true. The best recruiting tool, believe it or not, David, is war itself. Uh,
Mm.
you know,
Lads want to fight.
yeah,
Lads want to fight, for heaven's sake. Of course.
it's actually more subtle in some ways because the reason we have uniforms is because it makes people feel good about themselves, and the whole sort of ritual associated with being in the military, the fact that you come home and people sort of say, "Oh, you're a veteran, fantastic," all that sort of thing, helps. But yeah, I'll give you a perverse example of what's going on. Now, I'm a veteran of 35 years. I've been in 3 wars. Now, a person who joins the armed forces goes for a day's training and then resigns can claim to be a veteran with all the benefits that I have, such as they are. So there are all sorts of idiocies associated with the way the politicians structure our lives. The most interesting experience I had in the whole of my career was sitting next to Mrs. Thatcher after the Falklands. And I thought, what on earth am I going to say to her? And she'd invited some people up, and I was one of them. And I said, what did you learn from the Falklands? And I said, I'll tell you what I learned. And she said, what I learned was that what you have to tell the military is what political outcomes you want, not military ones, and then say you provide the military means to deliver that. And that's probably the most sensible thing I heard in 35 years. Now, that's been distorted by politicians to say we're going to do social engineering with the armed forces. The armed forces are there to defend democracy, not reflect it in many ways. We've got corrupted in the way we've put these quotas in, we've put all these DEI measures in. At the end of the day, the enemy does not respect any of this. If you
No, but sorry, again, you are being, I think, incredibly tactful. Can we look at what the consequences of all of this are? The size of our army in 30 years has shrunk from 167,000 to 72. That in practice, it can barely mount one division of
Oh, David, I would
30,000.
say I would say barely one brigade.
Barely a brigade.
I would think so. In
It is,
fighting,
I mean, it is extraordinary. And then again, I think this will be the thing that most shocks people. We have put army recruitment in the hands of one of the companies with the worst public reputation in Britain, Capita, otherwise generally known as Crapita. And the result is that what DEI has led to, and this, I think, will shock people. It might even shock you, though I imagine you actually know the figures. 30 to 40% of army recruits, including the Royal Regiments, including the Grenadier Guards and whatever, are foreigners. These are people, again, I am quoting directly from my friend Alan Mallison, Brigadier Mallison, writing in the Telegraph. These are people whose English is so poor that they could not be used as auxiliaries to the police in case of a domestic problem where you had to invoke the armed forces. How on earth can we expect them to be loyal to a country and they cannot even speak the language? I mean, these are, in other words, can we again really say the truth? We have a half, not simply an incompetent army, a small army. We've got a half mercenary army, mere mercenaries.
Well, David, I'll take you back to the end of the Roman era in Britain. If you remember, that's exactly what we did. We brought in basically Anglo-Saxon mercenaries to basically keep out their mates. So we're doing the same thing again. But the issue is that again, I get back to perverse incentives. If you want to be a lieutenant general who's a major general, you simply fill the numbers. We're in Henry IV Part 2 country with Falstaff going out to Gloucestershire and recruiting any old soldier.
Or the very model of a modern major general.
Yeah.
In other words, you recite the latest mantras, and the one thing you never do is fight. I think we now have, if I remember correctly, a chief of the defence staff who has never seen combat.
Yeah, that's where we are at the moment.
I mean, can we just, everybody just pause? We have a chief of the defence staff who has never seen combat. I cannot think of a moment in British or English history when this would have been true. So, in other words, all the prattle of our politicians talking about the need to stand up to Russia, how disgraceful it is, anybody, otherwise known as Nigel Farage, might have said anything nice about Putin. It is entire wind, isn't it? There is nothing serious that we can do.
David, I have to say that I am fully against sending troops to so-called peacekeep in Ukraine.
Me too, but that's another matter.
But the fact of life is we're not capable of fighting and killing Russians. And if you're not capable of doing that, you're not going to deter them. So you're just going, frankly, camping for fun.
It's wind. It's wind. So I think what we've done in that is to sketch, in your lifetime, a shattering decline in Britain's military capacity, from a country that back in the 1980s was capable of an important, very long distance, amphibious, complex operation, fought with distinction, to a country now that, again, if I can remind you, you probably were indeed still serving in 2007, when you get that disgraceful surrender to the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in the Gulf. An episode nobody, as far as I could see, was court-martialed. In the 18th century, there was a lieutenant, and I think there was a captain of the naval lieutenant and a captain of the Marines. Both of them should have been court-martialed.
David, I have to tell you,
would you not agree?
Well, I fell out with the Admiralty Board at the time because I said they should court-martial the officers. Pour encourager les autres, exactly that.
Precisely.
And the Admiralty Board at the time said, well, we find it difficult in law, human rights law, all this sort of thing. And I said, it doesn't matter whether you acquit them. At least you show we've actually taken some action and we disapprove of it. That was the lesson from the Invergordon mutiny in the 1930s as well. And I'm afraid to say we have lost touch with our traditional way of fighting. And that's the real problem. Just a bit of good news, David, on the army is that we are depopulating the battlefield now. We are using long-range strike. We're using drones, as you know. The fact that Ajax is going to be taken out with a single drone strike tells you that you don't need it. If you go to Ukraine now, for example, there are no armoured vehicles at the front. Everybody marches if they go. to the front underneath infrared blankets, so they're not detected by drones. So the whole character of warfare is changing such that we don't need these things anymore. It's going to be a totally different battlefield, and soldiers will be specialists in future, not the sort of grunts with a bayonet. So my biggest complaint about defence, and it always was when I was in the armed forces, they're trying to perfect the last day of the previous war and spending huge amounts of money on it rather than preparing for the first day of the next one. And that was my last job in the armed forces, was predicting ahead. And I'm afraid to say you'll be familiar with the story of Cassandra, who, of course, was given the gift of prophecy, but also was cursed with never being believed. And that's the story of my life in the armed forces, because I actually forecast in 2008, what the world would be like in 2025. And it's not far off. And we should have prepared for that. So this inability to look beyond the next election, because that's the political direction, doesn't give you a strategic look at the way we should develop our armed forces.